The morning shift change on Meridian Station always reminded Thomas Reeves of a carefully choreographed dance performed by people who had forgotten the steps. Humans rushed past each other with the determined efficiency of worker ants, clutching steaming cups of synthesized caffeine and muttering into their personal communicators about quotas, deadlines, and the 17 different forms required to change a light bulb in neutral space. Thomas navigated the central transit hub with practiced invisibility, a skill he'd perfected during his 3 years as a junior compliance officer. The trick was to walk fast enough to appear purposeful, but not so fast that anyone might mistake him for someone important enough to burden with actual responsibility. His daily route took him past the diplomatic quarter, through the commercial sector, and finally to the cramped compliance offices, where he would spend the next 8 hours ensuring that interstellar paperwork was filed in triplicate and properly stamped with the seal of bureaucratic approval. The hub's massive viewing ports revealed the endless star field beyond, occasionally interrupted by the geometric precision of cargo vessels or the sleek curves of diplomatic shuttles. Somewhere out there, the war between Earth's colonial territories and the Zephyrian Commonwealth had supposedly paused for peace negotiations, though Thomas had noticed that ceasefire seemed to be a remarkably flexible concept when applied to military supply contracts. He was mentally cataloging the morning's irregularities: 3 shipping manifests with suspicious weight discrepancies, a customs declaration written entirely in what appeared to be ancient Martian poetry, and someone's attempt to classify a crate of military-grade plasma rifles as therapeutic massage equipment, when he noticed her. The woman sat alone on what appeared to be an ordinary bench near the hub's central fountain, but Thomas's trained eye caught the subtle wrongness immediately. The bench itself was unremarkable. Standard station furniture, brushed metal with cushioned seats, positioned to offer a pleasant view of the artificial waterfall that recycled the same 1,000 gallons of water in an endless loop. But the space around it was wrong. Humans flowed past in all directions, but none came closer than 3 meters to where she sat. Thomas paused beside a decorative pillar and observed the phenomenon with professional curiosity. A businessman approached the bench, apparently intending to sit while he made a call, then suddenly remembered an urgent appointment and veered away. A maintenance worker heading straight for the nearby service panel developed an inexplicable interest in a completely different panel 20 meters away. 2 tourists consulting their station maps simultaneously decided they needed to find the restrooms, despite having passed 3 sets of facilities in the last 50 meters. The woman herself seemed oblivious to the elaborate avoidance ballet. She sat with quiet dignity, reading what appeared to be a data tablet, occasionally turning a page with the same casual gesture humans used. Her clothes were simple but well-tailored: dark pants, a cream-colored tunic, and a lightweight jacket that suggested someone of modest means but good taste. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a practical style that revealed the subtle points of her ears. Zephyrian, then. That explained some of the avoidance, though not all of it. The ceasefire had brought a steady stream of Zephyrian diplomats, trade representatives, and cultural attachés to Meridian Station. Most humans had adapted to their presence with the grudging pragmatism that characterized all successful space dwellers. You might not like your neighbors, but you couldn't afford to be rude to anyone who might control your oxygen supply. But this was different. This felt more like fear than prejudice. Thomas checked his chronometer and realized he'd been standing there for nearly 5 minutes, staring at a woman who was doing nothing more suspicious than reading. If anyone from his department noticed, they'd probably assume he was conducting surveillance and promote him, which was the last thing he wanted. Responsibility was the enemy of the quiet life. He was about to continue his route when the morning announcements crackled through the station speakers, delivered in the cheerfully bureaucratic tone that made even emergency alerts sound like invitations to a particularly boring office party. "Good morning. Meridian Station residents and visitors. Today marks day 97 of successful ceasefire implementation. All personnel are reminded that witness benches are sacred diplomatic furniture, installed pursuant to the Meridian Accords of 2387. Unauthorized activation may result in immediate quarantine and review by the Tribunal Council. Please remember that the breakfast menu in Sector 7 has been updated to include genuine Earth bacon. Though supplies are limited and fighting in the cafeteria remains prohibited under Station Regulation 847B. Thomas felt something click into place in his mind, like a bureaucratic puzzle piece finding its proper slot. Witness bench. That's what she was sitting on. He'd heard the warnings countless times, had even filed reports about their proper maintenance and cleaning schedules, but he'd never actually seen one in use. Most station residents treated them like expensive furniture too important to sit on, like the formal dining chairs his grandmother had covered in plastic. The woman looked up from her tablet as if sensing his scrutiny, and their eyes met across the bustling transit hub. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, almost golden in the artificial light, and there was something ancient in them despite her apparently young face. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just regarded him with the patient expression of someone who had grown accustomed to being watched. Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment at being caught staring. He started to look away, to continue his route to the compliance offices where he could hide behind stacks of shipping manifests and pretend this moment had never happened. But something in her expression stopped him, not pleading, not hostile, just waiting, as if she had been sitting there for a very long time expecting something specific to happen. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him safely anonymous for 3 years, began cataloging all the reasons he should walk away. She was clearly involved in some kind of diplomatic situation above his clearance level. The bench was sacred furniture, whatever that meant, and activating it sounded like the kind of career-ending mistake that would result in him being transferred to a monitoring station in the asteroid belt. He had 17 reports to file before lunch, a performance review next week, and absolutely no desire to become the kind of person who got involved in interstellar incidents. But his grandmother had always said that the difference between a decent person and a bureaucrat was what you did when nobody was watching and nobody would thank you for it. Thomas walked toward the bench. The ambient noise of the transit hub seemed to fade as he approached, replaced by a subtle humming that might have been coming from the bench itself, or might have been his imagination. Up close, he could see that the woman's tablet displayed what looked like legal documents, dense blocks of text in multiple languages including several he didn't recognize. Her fingers were long and elegant, with the slight calluses that suggested someone who worked with her hands despite her professional appearance. He sat down. The moment his weight settled on the cushioned seat, the bench began to vibrate with a barely perceptible frequency, like a tuning fork struck too gently to hear. The sensation traveled up through his spine and seemed to resonate in his chest, creating an odd rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat that wasn't quite his own. The woman turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd noticed her, she seemed genuinely surprised. Her amber eyes widened slightly, and she tilted her head in a gesture that was unmistakably questioning despite the absence of words. Around them, the careful choreography of avoidance became more frantic. The businessman who had been circling the area for the past 10 minutes suddenly discovered an urgent need to inspect the artwork in the opposite corridor. A group of tourists who had been gradually working their way toward the fountain took one look at the now-occupied bench and decided they were desperately interested in the gift shop. Even the maintenance worker who had been steadfastly ignoring the service panel behind the bench abruptly packed up his tools and left. "Well," Thomas said, surprised by how normal his voice sounded, "this is either the most comfortable bench in known space, or we've just accidentally triggered some kind of diplomatic incident." The woman's lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical cadence typical of Zephyrians, but her standard was perfect, with just enough accent to make it interesting. "Given the rate at which people have been fleeing this area," she said, "I suspect it might be both." Thomas's personal communicator began buzzing with the insistence of an angry wasp approximately 30 seconds after he sat down. The first message was from his immediate supervisor, Deputy Administrator Walsh, and consisted entirely of the words, "Get up now," repeated 17 times in progressively larger fonts. The second message was from someone called Senior Diplomatic Liaison Morrison, whom Thomas was fairly certain he'd never met, demanding his immediate presence for emergency consultation regarding unauthorized activation protocols. The third message was from his mother, reminding him to eat more vegetables and asking if he'd met any nice girls lately. "I'm getting the distinct impression," Thomas said, watching his communicator display scroll through increasingly frantic bureaucratic threats, "that sitting down just became the most complicated thing I've done all year." The woman beside him, he really needed to ask her name, glanced at his device with the expression of someone watching a mildly entertaining disaster. "That's actually slower than usual. When I first sat down 3 weeks ago, the emergency messages started before I'd even settled into the cushions properly." 3 weeks. Thomas felt his eyebrows attempt to climb into his hairline. "You've been sitting here for 3 weeks. Well, not continuously. That would be both physically uncomfortable and socially awkward. But yes, I've been returning here daily, waiting for someone to join me on what your people apparently call a witness bench." She gestured at the metal plaque mounted on the bench's armrest, which Thomas noticed for the first time bore inscriptions in both standard and flowing Zephyrian script. "Though I must admit, your arrival is somewhat later than I'd expected." Thomas tried to process this information while his communicator continued its electronic tantrum. "So you've just been sitting here, waiting, for 3 weeks. I'm very patient. It's a cultural trait we Zephyrians pride ourselves on, along with our superior hearing and our tendency to point out when humans are stating the obvious." Her amber eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement. "My name is Lyra, by the way. Lyra Nightwhisper, though I realize that sounds rather pretentious when translated into standard. The literal meaning is closer to she who watches stars while others sleep, which, as you can imagine, makes for awkward introductions at diplomatic functions." Thomas Reeves, and that's definitely more interesting than my name, which just means my parents had a disturbing lack of imagination. He was surprised to find himself relaxing despite the increasingly urgent buzzing from his communicator. "Though I have to ask, why exactly have you been waiting for someone to sit with you? Is this some kind of Zephyrian tradition I should know about?" Lyra's expression grew more serious, though she still seemed faintly amused by something. "Actually, it's more of a legal requirement. You see, I'm technically an exile who shouldn't exist according to official records, sitting on a piece of ancient diplomatic technology that your people's ancestors were apparently much cleverer about than your current generation realizes." The bench beneath them continued its subtle vibration, and Thomas was becoming aware of an odd sensation in his chest. Not painful, just different, as if his heartbeat was trying to match some external rhythm. "I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that exile who shouldn't exist is the kind of problem that requires more than standard bureaucratic solutions. Considerably more, yes. According to my official documentation, I was convicted of smuggling restricted Earth technologies to separatist colonies and should have been deported approximately 21 days ago. According to reality, I was framed by someone with access to both human and Zephyrian governmental databases, and the exile order is a forgery so sophisticated that it fooled every security system on this station." Thomas felt his compliance officer instincts stirring despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved. Forged exile documents are essentially impossible to create. The cross-referencing systems alone require clearances that maybe dozen people in known space actually have. Exactly. Which is why I've been sitting on this particular bench, waiting for someone honest enough to trigger the witness protocols. Lyra gestured at the plaque again. These benches were installed during the original Meridian Accords as a way to ensure truthful testimony in diplomatic proceedings. They're essentially biological lie detectors that can read intentions and emotional states through biorhythmic analysis. The odd sensation in Thomas's chest suddenly made more sense. So that's why it feels like my heart is trying to synchronize with something else. The bench is calibrating our biorhythms to establish a baseline for truth detection. Once the process is complete, neither of us will be able to lie while we're in physical contact with it. More importantly, the sanctuary protocols will prevent anyone from arresting or detaining either of us until we either affirm our testimony before the Tribunal Council or formally dissolve the bond. Thomas's communicator had progressed to displaying messages in what appeared to be ancient Vulcan, which he was fairly certain wasn't one of his language settings. And if we choose to affirm our testimony, then we have until dawn to present evidence of my innocence to a joint session of human and Zephyrian officials. If we're found to be lying, the penalty is typically exile to a monitoring station in the Outer Rim, though some of the older treaties mention more creative punishments involving airlocks and the vast emptiness of space. Well, Thomas said, watching Deputy Administrator Walsh stride across the transit hub with the determined expression of a man about to deliver very bad news. When you put it like that, how could I possibly say no? Walsh arrived with a small entourage of station security personnel, all of whom maintained a respectful distance from the bench while looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Walsh himself was a thin, nervous man who had elevated the art of middle management to a form of performance anxiety, and he was currently displaying the kind of barely controlled panic that suggested his own supervisors had been asking pointed questions. Reeves, Walsh's voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. What exactly do you think you're doing? Sitting, sir. It's a fairly standard human activity. I can file a report about it if you'd like, though it might be somewhat brief. Don't get smart with me, Junior. You're sitting on a class of diplomatic artifact with a known exile. Do you have any idea what kind of paperwork this is going to generate? Thomas felt Lyra's silent laughter through the bench's neural connection, which was becoming stronger by the minute. Honestly, sir, I'm more worried about the paperwork involved in getting up. According to the sanctuary protocols, attempting to forcibly remove either of us could be considered an act of war against both Earth and the Zephyrian Commonwealth. Walsh's face cycled through several interesting shades of red before settling on a color that reminded Thomas of overcooked beets. You can't just decide to activate ancient diplomatic protocols because you feel sorry for someone. Actually, Lyra interjected pleasantly, the protocols don't require intent. They activate automatically when two individuals of different species sit on the bench simultaneously while harboring no deceptive intentions toward each other. The fact that Mr. Reeves was able to sit down at all suggests that his motivations were genuine. This is ridiculous, Walsh muttered, pulling out his own communicator and presumably consulting with higher authorities. There has to be some kind of override, some way too. His voice trailed off as he read whatever message had just appeared on his screen. His expression shifted from angry frustration to something approaching terror, and he looked at Thomas and Lyra as if they had just informed him that they were planning to redecorate the station using live explosives. Commander Chen is on her way, he said weakly. Thomas felt Lyra tense beside him. Commander Sarah Chen, Enforcement Squad 7. You know her. By reputation. She's the one who arrested me 3 weeks ago. Lyra's voice remained calm, but Thomas could sense her anxiety through their growing neural connection. She's also one of the few people on this station with the authority to override sanctuary protocols in cases of imminent diplomatic threat. Well, Thomas said, watching Walsh retreat to what he apparently considered a safe distance, I suppose we should figure out how to prove your innocence before someone with the power to ignore ancient diplomatic law decides we're too much trouble to keep around. The bench's vibration had settled into a steady rhythm that seemed to match their synchronized heartbeats, and Thomas was beginning to understand why the morning announcements always warned about unauthorized activation. The neural connection was subtle but undeniable. He could sense Lyra's emotions as a kind of background presence in his own thoughts, and he suspected she was experiencing something similar. The exiled documents are stored in the station's central database, Lyra said. If we could access the creation timestamps and cross-reference them with the maintenance schedules for both Earth's colonial administration and the Zephyrian Ministry of External Affairs, we might be able to prove they were filed during a period when legitimate processing would have been impossible, Thomas finished. The problem is that accessing those records requires security clearances I definitely don't have. But you do have access to the compliance database, which includes shipping manifests, customs declarations, and transfer authorizations for all cargo moving through Meridian Station. Thomas felt a familiar spark of professional curiosity. You think the smuggling operation, the real one, is moving through official channels. I think someone has been very clever about hiding a massive illegal operation inside routine bureaucratic processes. And I think you might be exactly the right person to help me prove it. The sound of approaching boots echoed across the transit hub, and Thomas caught sight of Commander Chen and her enforcement team making their way through the crowd. The commander was a tall, stern-looking woman with the kind of military bearing that suggested she had never met a regulation she couldn't enforce. Right then, Thomas said, feeling the weight of several ancient diplomatic protocols settling around him like a particularly expensive straitjacket. Let's see if we can solve an interstellar conspiracy before breakfast. What could possibly go wrong? Commander Sarah Chen approached their bench with the measured stride of someone who had learned to project authority across 3 different gravity zones and at least 5 distinct cultural interpretations of personal space. Her enforcement team flanked her at precise intervals, a mixed group of human and Zephyrian officers who managed to look simultaneously professional and deeply uncomfortable with their current assignment. Ms. Night Whisper, Chen said, stopping exactly 3 meters from the bench, close enough to demonstrate authority, far enough to respect the sanctuary protocols. Mr. Reeves, I understand we have what the diplomatic corps likes to call a situation. Thomas noticed that Chen's tone was carefully neutral, but the neural link was picking up something else, a faint undercurrent of what felt almost like relief. Either the commander was having a very good day, or their activation of the witness bench had solved some problem he wasn't aware of yet. Commander, Lyra replied with the sort of polite formality that somehow managed to sound both respectful and slightly mocking. How lovely to see you again. I trust your investigation into my alleged crimes has been proceeding smoothly in my absence. Your case has been complicated by recent developments. Chen consulted a data pad that she held with the careful precision of someone reading from a script. The Tribunal Council has agreed to hear your testimony, provided you can present credible evidence of the irregularities you claim exist in your exile documentation. Thomas felt Lyra's surprise ripple through their connection. That's actually more reasonable than I expected. The catch, Chen continued, is that you have until dawn tomorrow to compile that evidence. If you cannot substantiate your claims, both of you will be required to submit to immediate processing under standard exile protocols. Both of us. Thomas tried to keep his voice level, though he suspected the neural link was broadcasting his growing panic to anyone paying attention. I'm just here because the lady looked lonely, and I have an overdeveloped sense of civic responsibility. Chen's expression suggested she was dealing with a particularly slow child. Mr. Reeves, the moment you sat on that bench, you became a co-witness under the Meridian Accords. Your biorhythmic signature is now entangled with Ms. Nightwhisper's testimony. If she's lying, you're complicit. If she's telling the truth, you're both protected by sanctuary law until the matter is resolved. Right, Thomas said weakly. I definitely should have read more of those interstellar law manuals. The good news, Lyra said with the kind of cheerfulness that suggested she was enjoying his discomfort, is that the neural link works both ways. I can now access your pattern recognition abilities, and you can tap into my enhanced memory capacity. We're essentially a two-person investigative team with a shared consciousness. Thomas felt something shift in his mind, not intrusive, but definitely present. Suddenly, details about station procedures and shipping protocols seemed clearer, more connected. It was like having access to a filing system he'd been organizing for years but never really understood the purpose of. That's actually quite useful, he admitted, though I have to ask enhanced memory. Zephyrians retain detailed sensory impressions for decades. I can recall not just what I saw 3 weeks ago, but what I heard, smelled, even the ambient electromagnetic frequencies in the room. Lyra's eyes unfocused slightly. For instance, I can tell you that when I was arrested, someone in the detention area was eating synthetic raspberry pastries while listening to what I believe humans call death metal, at a volume that violated at least 6 noise ordinances. Chen cleared her throat with the air of someone trying to regain control of a conversation that had wandered into territory marked, definitely not covered in the manual. If you're quite finished discussing your new psychic partnership, perhaps we could focus on the matter at hand. You have 18 hours to prove your innocence or face exile. I suggest you use that time wisely. Commander, Thomas said, surprising himself with his boldness. Hypothetically speaking, if we were to discover evidence of a larger conspiracy involving station personnel, what would be the proper protocols for reporting such findings? Chen's carefully neutral expression flickered for just a moment, and through the neural link, Thomas caught a flash of something that felt like concern mixed with anticipation. Any evidence of corruption or misconduct should be reported through proper channels immediately. Though I should mention that certain aspects of station security are currently under review by external auditors. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Reeves, your supervisor has filed 17 separate requests for your immediate reassignment to duties that don't involve sitting on ancient diplomatic furniture. I've temporarily denied all of them pending resolution of this matter. 17. Thomas felt a flutter of pride. That's got to be some kind of record. Once Chen and her team had departed, Thomas and Lyra found themselves alone again in their bubble of carefully maintained avoidance. The neural link had stabilized into something almost comfortable. He could sense Lyra's thoughts without intruding on them, like having a conversation partner who could finish his sentences, but was polite enough not to. So, he said, accessing his compliance database through his wrist-mounted terminal, let's see what kinds of interesting shipping irregularities we can find. What exactly were you working on when you were arrested? Freight coordination for humanitarian relief shipments, mostly medical supplies, food processors, basic terraforming equipment, the kinds of things colonies need to survive independently. Lyra leaned closer to look at his screen, and Thomas caught a faint scent that reminded him of winter mornings and starlight. I was reviewing shipping manifests when I noticed that several relief stations were receiving equipment that seemed excessive for their stated purposes. Thomas pulled up the relevant files, his enhanced pattern recognition immediately flagging dozens of anomalies. Relief Station Alpha 7 requisitioned enough medical nanobots to treat a plague outbreak, but their reported population is only 300 people. Relief Station Delta 2 requested agricultural processors with a capacity to feed 50,000, but they're supposed to be a research outpost with a staff of 12. And here's the interesting part, Lyra said, her enhanced memory overlaying details onto the data stream. Every single one of these relief stations is located in sectors where separatist colonies have been establishing independent settlements. Settlements that, according to official records, don't exist. Thomas felt the pieces clicking together with the satisfying precision of a well-designed bureaucratic puzzle. Someone's been using humanitarian relief programs to supply separatist military operations. But that would require coordination between human colonial administration and Zephyrian aid organizations. It would also require someone with access to both governments' shipping databases to ensure the paperwork looked legitimate. Lyra's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Someone with the clearance levels necessary to create forged exile documents. Thomas was about to respond when his terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender was listed as Automated System Alert, but the content made his blood run cold. Security Advisory. Compliance Officer T. Reeves has been flagged for irregular data access patterns. Terminal access will be suspended pending supervisory review. That was fast, Lyra observed. Either your people are remarkably efficient or someone's been monitoring your database queries in real time. Thomas tried to access another file, but his screen displayed only the cheerful message. Access denied. Please contact your system administrator for assistance. The exclamation point somehow made it more insulting. Well, he said, leaning back against the bench, it looks like our investigation just got significantly more complicated. Not necessarily. Lyra smiled with the expression of someone who had been planning for exactly this contingency. I may not have access to your compliance database, but I do have an excellent memory and 3 weeks' worth of observations about this station's daily operations. She closed her eyes, and through the neural link, Thomas felt her consciousness expand outward like a search algorithm running through vast archives of sensory data. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with discovery. The morning I was arrested, I saw Deputy Administrator Walsh meeting with someone from the Zephyrian trade delegation in a maintenance corridor. They were discussing shipping schedules for routes that don't appear in any official documentation. Walsh was nervous. I could smell the stress hormones from 20 meters away. Thomas felt his own memories shifting and reorganizing, as Lyra's enhanced recall triggered connections he'd never noticed before. Walsh has been processing an unusual number of emergency authorization codes lately. Equipment transfers that bypass normal review procedures because they're classified as critical humanitarian need. And here's the truly interesting part, Lyra continued, her voice taking on the focused intensity of someone solving a particularly challenging puzzle. The Zephyrian official Walsh was meeting with was Trade Coordinator Vex Starweaver. According to the neural link, you've processed at least a dozen shipping authorizations with his signature in the past month. Thomas felt his enhanced pattern recognition abilities, highlighting connections across weeks of routine paperwork. Every single one of those authorizations was for equipment shipments to relief stations, medical supplies, terraforming equipment, food processors. And every single relief station on those shipping manifests corresponds to the location of a separatist military outpost. Lyra opened her eyes fully, and Thomas could see the terrible understanding reflected there. They're not just smuggling weapons to one side of the conflict. They're supplying both sides with just enough equipment to keep fighting, but not enough for either side to achieve decisive victory. Thomas felt the neural link transmitting a sensation of cold certainty as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. They're maintaining the ceasefire indefinitely, as long as both sides feel secure enough to continue negotiations, but threatened enough to keep buying military equipment. Someone is making enormous profits from the most carefully managed war in galactic history, Lyra finished. And when I stumbled across their operation 3 weeks ago, They needed a scapegoat to explain any irregularities in the shipping records. Thomas looked around the transit hub, suddenly seeing the routine bustle of station life in an entirely different light. The question is, how many people are involved? And more importantly, how do we prove any of this before dawn? Lyra's smile was sharp enough to cut through diplomatic immunity. We start by figuring out exactly who had access to create those forged exile documents. And then we trace every single shipping authorization back to its source. Right, Thomas said, feeling the weight of several interstellar conspiracies settling around his shoulders like a particularly expensive coat he'd never asked to wear. Just another routine day in compliance, then. Dawn arrived on Meridian Station with the artificial precision of a computer-controlled solar simulator, though Thomas had long since stopped noticing the difference between real and synthetic sunlight. He and Lyra had spent the night compiling evidence through the combined power of his bureaucratic obsessiveness and her enhanced memory, creating what was either the most comprehensive expose of interstellar corruption in galactic history, or an elaborate fantasy that would result in both of them being exiled to monitor asteroid mining operations for the rest of their natural lives. The Grand Assembly Chamber was more intimidating at dawn than Thomas had expected. The adaptive gravity zones made him feel slightly seasick. The atmospheric controls kept shifting between Earth Standard and something that smelled faintly of cinnamon and electricity, and the translation matrices hummed with enough processing power to convert poetry into mathematics and back again, without losing the metaphors. "I have to admit," Thomas whispered to Lyra as they took their seats before the Tribunal Council, "this is significantly more impressive than the conference room where I usually get yelled at for filing reports in the wrong order." The neural link carried her amusement along with a flutter of nervousness. "Try not to be too impressed. Half of this is just diplomatic theater designed to make everyone feel important. Though I grant you, the risk of actual exile does add a certain dramatic weight to the proceedings." The Tribunal Council consisted of 12 representatives from various species, though Thomas noticed that the 3 human representatives seemed unusually interested in examining their data pads rather than making eye contact. Presiding over the assembly was Chancellor Meridian, a dignified Altarian whose blue-tinted skin and crystalline hair made him look like he'd been carved from a particularly artistic glacier. "We are gathered," Chancellor Meridian announced in a voice that somehow managed to be simultaneously melodious and authoritative, "to hear testimony regarding irregularities in the exile documentation of Lyra Nightwhisper, as witnessed by Thomas Reeves under the sanctuary protocols of the ancient witness bench." Thomas felt the neural link transmit Lyra's sudden spike of alarm. Through their shared consciousness, he caught a flash of recognition that made his own heart rate accelerate. 2 of the human tribunal members were showing the subtle biorhythmic patterns that suggested advanced knowledge of their testimony. "Chancellor," Lyra said, rising with the fluid grace that Thomas was learning to associate with her species, "before we present our evidence, I must invoke the right of verification under Section 12 of the Meridian Accords." A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates. Chancellor Meridian's crystalline eyebrows rose in what might have been surprise. "The right of verification has not been invoked in 47 years, Ms. Nightwhisper. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" "I am. The neural link has revealed that some members of this tribunal possess foreknowledge of our testimony, suggesting that our investigation has been compromised." Thomas felt his enhanced pattern recognition abilities suddenly click into overdrive as Lyra shared her enhanced sensory perceptions with him. The biorhythmic readings, the electromagnetic frequencies of personal communicators, the subtle chemical signatures of stress hormones, it all painted a picture of a tribunal that was far from impartial. Chancellor Meridian consulted a device that looked like a cross between a calculator and a small crystal garden. "Very well. The right of verification is granted. All tribunal members will submit to biorhythmic truth scanning during the proceedings. The three human representatives exchanged glances that would have been subtle to normal observation, but through Lyra's enhanced senses, Thomas could practically taste their panic. One of them, whom he recognized as Senior Trade Administrator Kellison, activated what appeared to be a standard communicator, but was broadcasting on frequencies that definitely weren't standard. "Chancellor," Thomas said, surprising himself with his boldness, "Administrator Kellison is attempting to communicate with someone outside the chamber using encrypted channels." Kellison's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on the pale gray of someone who had just realized their careful plans were collapsing around them. "I was merely consulting with my staff regarding procedural matters. Funny thing about the neural link," Lyra said conversationally, "is that it's made me quite good at detecting lies. Mr. Kellison, you've been in communication with the same parties who created my forged exile documents." The chamber erupted in the kind of dignified chaos that only highly trained diplomats could produce. Chancellor Meridian called for order while simultaneously activating security protocols that sealed the chamber and began jamming all unauthorized communications. Commander Chen, who had been standing at attention near the entrance, moved with sudden purpose toward the tribunal seating area. "If I may, Chancellor," Chen said, producing a data crystal that gleamed with official authentication codes, "Enforcement Squad 7 has been conducting a parallel investigation into irregularities in station supply chains. Our findings support Ms. Nightwhisper's claims." Thomas felt Lyra's satisfaction through their connection. "You knew," he said through their link. "You knew Chen was investigating the same conspiracy." "I suspected. The neural connection works on truth and intent, remember. Chen's been genuinely conflicted about something for weeks. Someone with her authority doesn't spend that much time worrying unless they're trying to decide between following orders and doing what's right." Chen activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with shipping manifests, communication logs, and financial records. "The smuggling operation involves at least 3 human administrators, 4 Zephyrian trade coordinators, and 17 shell companies spread across 12 different star systems. They've been using humanitarian relief programs to supply both sides of the conflict with military equipment, ensuring that the war continues indefinitely while generating massive profits." Administrator Kellison stood abruptly, his face now displaying the desperate expression of someone who had just realized that their carefully constructed house of cards was being demolished by people with very large fans. "This is preposterous. I demand to speak with my legal counsel." "I'm afraid," Chancellor Meridian said with the tone of someone delivering news that was both regrettable and entirely predictable, "that your legal counsel was arrested approximately 30 minutes ago on charges of conspiracy to commit interstellar fraud, along with Trade Coordinator Vex Starweaver, Deputy Administrator Walsh, and several other individuals whose names appear on these shipping authorizations." Thomas felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Walsh, who had probably been pulled into the conspiracy through a combination of blackmail and bureaucratic ineptitude rather than actual malice. Then again, the man had filed 17 requests to have Thomas reassigned, which seemed excessive even under the circumstances. "The forged exile documents," Chen continued, "were created using access codes belonging to Kellison and Starweaver during a coordinated maintenance blackout that they arranged specifically to hide the database intrusion. Ms. Nightwhisper was framed because she discovered shipping irregularities that threatened to expose the entire operation." Lyra stood, and Thomas felt their neural link transmit a sudden surge of confidence and determination. "Chancellor, members of the tribunal, the evidence shows not only that I am innocent of the charges against me, but that my arrest was part of a conspiracy. The charges against Lyra Nightwhisper are dismissed with full vindication. The evidence of conspiracy is overwhelming, and the individuals responsible will face trial under both human and Zephyrian law. He paused, his crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that somehow conveyed judicial satisfaction. Ms. Nightwhisper, Mr. Reeves, the Tribunal Council extends its gratitude for your courage in exposing this corruption. The neural link carried Lyra's relief and triumph, mixed with something warmer that made Thomas's chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with synchronized heartbeats. As the chamber began to empty, and the various officials went about the business of arresting conspirators and filing the paperwork that would inevitably follow such a dramatic diplomatic incident, Thomas realized that he was still sitting on the witness bench, still connected to someone who had changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. "So," he said, as they watched Commander Chen escort the disgraced tribunal members toward what was undoubtedly a very unpleasant conversation with interstellar law enforcement, "I suppose this means I'm going to need a new job. Something tells me Deputy Administrator Walsh won't be in a position to write me a positive performance review." Lyra's laughter rippled through their connection like warm honey. "Actually, Chancellor Meridian mentioned something about establishing a new interspecies ethics committee to prevent this kind of conspiracy from happening again. Apparently, they're looking for someone with experience in both bureaucratic investigation and Neuralink communication." "That's oddly specific," Thomas said, though he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "They're also looking for someone with enhanced memory capabilities and a talent for detecting deception." Lyra turned to face him fully, her amber eyes bright with possibilities. "The position comes with diplomatic immunity, access to the best coffee synthesizers in known space, and a partner who finds your tendency to overthink simple situations surprisingly endearing." Thomas felt his heart do something complicated that might have been joy mixed with terror, and a healthy dose of bureaucratic anxiety. "Are you offering me a job, or asking me on a date, or proposing some kind of permanent psychic partnership?" "Yes," Lyra said simply. 6 months later, Thomas sat in his new office in the diplomatic quarter, reviewing a case file that involved 3 different species, 2 competing trade agreements, and a shipping dispute that somehow centered around a cargo container full of what the manifest listed as decorative geological specimens, but which were clearly military-grade plasma cores wrapped in pretty ribbons. The witness bench had been moved to a place of honor in the center of their shared workspace, not because they needed it for investigations anymore, but because the neural link had become something neither of them wanted to give up. It allowed them to work together with an efficiency that had impressed even the most skeptical diplomatic observers, sharing insights and observations across species barriers in ways that were revolutionizing interstellar cooperation. "Thomas," Lyra called from her desk, where she was examining what appeared to be a shipping manifest written entirely in mathematical equations, "I think someone's trying to smuggle illegal AI components by disguising them as abstract art." "That's actually quite clever," Thomas replied, pulling up the corresponding customs declarations. "Though they probably should have realized that sculpture number 7, meditation on the futility of linear processing, is a dead giveaway when the weight specifications suggest it contains enough quantum processors to run a small starship." Through their link, he felt Lyra's amusement at the continuing creativity of interstellar criminals, along with her satisfaction at their partnership, and the quiet contentment that had replaced the desperate uncertainty of that morning, 6 months ago, when a lonely compliance officer had decided to sit down beside a woman who looked like she could use some company. "You know," Thomas said, looking out at the star field beyond their office windows, "I used to think the most exciting thing that would ever happen to me was finding a misfiled shipping manifest. And now I get to save the galaxy from bureaucratic corruption, while holding hands with someone who can remember exactly what the coffee tasted like on the day we met." Thomas smiled, feeling the neural link carry his happiness to someone